Close your eyes for a moment and picture a pirate ship at night. What do you see? Probably hammocks swaying gently in the ocean breeze. Maybe some romantic moonlight streaming through portholes. The soft sound of waves lapping against wooden hulls. Perhaps you're imagining something like a floating camping trip, where salty sea dogs drift off to peaceful slumber after counting their treasure. Well, I'm here tonight to completely destroy that image. Before we dive into what sleeping on a pirate ship actually felt like, and trust me, it's nothing like what you're picturing, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Your bedroom? A cozy living room? Maybe you're already tucked into clean sheets, perhaps with a fan humming quietly in the background, or a white noise machine creating that perfect sleep environment. And while you're settling in, do me a favor and drop a comment below with any historical topic you'd like me to explore in a future episode. Could be anything: medieval toilets, what Vikings actually ate, how people survived winter in ancient times. I read every single comment, and your curiosity drives these deep dives into the past. But tonight, we're going aboard a pirate vessel, and I need you to forget everything Hollywood ever taught you about life at sea. Here's the thing that's going to unravel your entire mental picture. Most pirates never slept lying down. Not once during their entire time at sea.
Here, drink this.
The very idea of stretching out horizontally, the way you're probably positioned right now, was a luxury so rare that when it happened, it was considered almost miraculous. Think about that for a second. You've probably never gone more than a day or two without lying flat to sleep. These men, and the occasional woman, went months, sometimes over a year, sleeping sitting up, curled in corners, or draped over coils of rope like human question marks. The hammock, that symbol of leisurely naval life? Most pirate ships didn't have nearly enough of them. A typical pirate vessel might have hammocks for the captain, maybe the quartermaster, and if they were very lucky, a few senior crew members. Everyone else, we're talking about 80 to 90% of the people on board, slept wherever they could wedge their bodies into the ship's architecture. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where your mental image starts to completely fall apart. The smell alone would have knocked you unconscious before you ever worried about finding a place to sleep. Picture this. You're in a wooden container, roughly the size of a large modern living room, packed with anywhere from 50 to 200 unwashed human bodies. These aren't people who've skipped a shower for a day or two. We're talking about human beings who haven't properly bathed in months, wearing the same clothes day after day, clothes that are soaked with sweat, salt water, tar, blood, and things I won't mention while you're trying to fall asleep. Now add to that the smell of the ship itself. The wood is constantly damp and rotting. There's bilge water sloshing around in the bottom. That's a mixture of seawater, human waste, food scraps, and whatever else has accumulated down there. The air below deck is so thick and putrid that newcomers would literally vomit from the smell alone. And this is where you're supposed to sleep. But wait, there's more. The noise. You're imagining gentle creaking and the soft sound of waves, aren't you? The reality was a constant symphony of groaning wood, snoring men, people coughing and retching, rats scurrying through the walls, and the ship's timbers flexing and straining with every wave. It was like trying to sleep inside a giant wooden drum that someone was constantly, gently beating. The temperature was either brutally hot or bone-chillingly cold, depending on where you were sailing. In tropical waters, the below-deck areas became suffocating ovens. Men would literally pass out from heat exhaustion. In northern waters, the cold was so intense that pirates would huddle together like penguins, sharing body heat just to survive the night. And here's the detail that really drives home how different this world was. Privacy didn't exist. Not even as a concept. You slept pressed against strangers, listening to their breathing, feeling their movements, sharing their body heat, whether you wanted to or not. The idea of having your own space, your own bed, your own room, these were fantasies beyond imagination. So why am I telling you all this? Why am I destroying your romantic notions of pirate life before we've even properly begun our journey? Because the truth about how pirates slept reveals something profound about human adaptability, about what people will endure for freedom, for adventure, for the chance to escape the even worse conditions they left behind on land. And yes, believe it or not, for many of these men, life on a pirate ship was actually an improvement over their previous circumstances. Tonight, we're going to explore not just the physical reality of sleeping on these vessels, but what it meant psychologically, socially, and spiritually to live in such intimate, harsh conditions with dozens of other desperate souls. We'll discover how sleep became a form of escape, how dreams took on almost mystical importance, and how the simple act of finding rest became a daily battle for survival. We'll uncover the ingenious ways pirates adapted to these impossible sleeping conditions, the unwritten rules that govern nighttime behavior, and the surprising social hierarchies that determined who slept where and when. And by the end of our journey together, you'll understand that the story of sleeping on a pirate ship is really the story of human resilience, of how people create community and find peace even in the most impossible circumstances. So settle in, get comfortable in whatever luxurious sleeping arrangement you've created for yourself tonight, and let's sail back to a time when simply lying down was a privilege, and sleep itself was an adventure. The waves are calling, the ship is creaking, and somewhere in the distance, a tired pirate is trying to find a few hours of rest before dawn breaks and the endless cycle of survival begins again. Let's start with what you think you know about pirates and sleep, because chances are, almost everything in your mental picture came from somewhere else entirely. And that somewhere else was usually trying to sell you something. The version most of us inherited goes something like this. Pirates lived this romantic, adventurous life at sea. They had hammocks strung up in neat rows below deck, swaying gently with the ship's motion. When they weren't busy burying treasure or sword fighting, they'd retire to their cozy sleeping quarters, maybe sharing stories and rum before drifting off to the peaceful sound of ocean waves. This image is so deeply embedded in our culture that it shows up everywhere. Children's books show pirates sleeping peacefully in hammocks. Movies depict ship quarters as rustic but charming, like floating cabins. Even historical documentaries often show clean, organized sleeping areas with individual hammocks for each crew member. But here's the thing. This entire image was constructed backwards, starting from the 18th and 19th century naval ships, then projected onto pirates, then romanticized by literature, then polished by Hollywood, and finally packaged for tourism. The hammock situation is a perfect example. Yes, hammocks existed on ships. But the neat rows of individual hammocks? That was a later naval innovation, something that developed in organized navies with standardized equipment and formal sleeping arrangements. Real pirate ships were captured merchant vessels, stolen naval ships, or hastily converted fishing boats. They didn't come with a full set of matching hammocks and convenient hanging points. Most pirate vessels had maybe a dozen hammocks total, and those went to whoever had the most seniority, the most intimidating reputation, or the most essential skills. The ship's carpenter might get a hammock because if he died from exhaustion, the ship would literally fall apart. The navigator might get one because without him, everyone would be lost at sea. But the average crew member? They made do with whatever they could find. The reality was that most pirates slept on the deck itself, using coiled ropes as pillows, sailcloth as blankets, and their own arms as cushions. They'd wedge themselves between cannons, curl up next to water barrels, or find a corner where two walls met and try to brace themselves so they wouldn't slide around when the ship rolled. And that brings us to another major misconception: the gentle swaying motion. You know that peaceful rocking sensation you imagine? In reality, ships didn't gently sway. They pitched violently, rolled unpredictably, and lurched suddenly. Sleeping meant constantly bracing yourself against the ship's movement. Pirates developed this unconscious ability to tense and relax their muscles in rhythm with the waves, even while unconscious. It was like sleeping while doing isometric exercises all night long. The cozy below-deck quarters image is perhaps the most wrong of all. Below deck on a pirate ship wasn't a series of rooms or even organized sleeping areas. It was essentially one large, dark, cramped space filled with supplies, weapons, water barrels, food stores, and whatever cargo they'd stolen. People slept wherever they could fit between these items. Imagine trying to sleep in a storage unit that's constantly moving, filled with heavy objects that could crush you if they shifted, with no windows, no ventilation, and dozens of other people competing for the same small spaces. That's closer to the reality. The popular image also completely misses the social dynamics of sleep on these ships. In our romanticized version, everyone just finds their hammock and goes to sleep. But in reality, sleeping arrangements were a complex social negotiation that happened every single night. Who got to sleep where was determined by a constantly shifting hierarchy based on recent contributions to the crew, personal relationships, physical intimidation, and sometimes just luck. There were unwritten rules about sleep that governed pirate society. You didn't take someone else's usual sleeping spot without permission. You didn't move around unnecessarily once people had settled in for the night. You didn't snore too loudly if you could help it, because that could literally get you thrown overboard. And you absolutely never, ever woke someone up unless the ship was sinking or under attack. The timing of sleep is another area where our modern assumptions fall apart. We imagine pirates having a normal day-night sleep cycle, maybe staying up a bit later for some rum and storytelling, then sleeping through the night. But ships required constant attention. Someone always had to be watching for other vessels, monitoring the weather, checking for leaks, adjusting sails, and maintaining course. This meant sleep happened in shifts, in fragments, whenever you could grab it. A pirate might sleep for 2 hours in the afternoon, then stay awake all night on watch duty, then catch another hour of sleep at dawn before starting the day's work. The idea of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep was as foreign to them as the idea of air conditioning or indoor plumbing. Even the basic assumption that pirates slept lying down is wrong most of the time. Space was so limited and so contested that many pirates learned to sleep sitting up, leaning against walls or barrels. Some slept standing up, wedged into corners where they couldn't fall over. Others perfected the art of sleeping while still partially alert, ready to wake up instantly if something went wrong. The romantic image of pirates sharing stories and bonding before sleep also misses the reality of exhaustion. These men were often so physically and mentally drained that they would collapse into unconsciousness the moment they stopped moving. There wasn't energy for socializing or storytelling. Sleep wasn't a social activity. It was a desperate biological necessity that you grabbed whenever and wherever you could. But here's what's really fascinating. The romanticized version we inherited isn't completely wrong about everything. Pirates did develop incredibly strong bonds with their crewmates. They did create their own culture and traditions. They did find ways to make their harsh life bearable, even meaningful. It's just that none of this happened in the cozy, organized way we imagine. It happened in spite of the brutal conditions, not because of some inherent romance in pirate life. The real story of how pirates slept is actually far more interesting than the sanitized version we inherited, because it's a story about human ingenuity, adaptation, and the surprising ways people create community even in the most impossible circumstances. So as we continue our journey tonight, remember that we're not just correcting historical misconceptions. We're uncovering a more complex, more human, and ultimately more fascinating truth about what it really meant to live and sleep on the edge of the world, where every night was a small victory against the forces trying to kill you. To understand how pirates really slept, we need to go back to the beginning, to the very first records of people trying to rest on moving vessels in the middle of dangerous waters. And that story starts not with pirates at all, but with something much more mundane: fishermen trying not to drown while catching their dinner. The earliest evidence we have of organized sleeping arrangements on ships comes from ancient Mediterranean fishing boats around 3000 BCE. These weren't grand vessels. They were barely more than large canoes with simple shelters. But archaeologists have found something fascinating in the remains of these boats: small carved grooves and notches in the wood, positioned at regular intervals along the sides. For decades, scholars thought these were decorative elements or maybe structural reinforcements. But recent analysis suggests something much more practical. These were anchor points for the very first shipboard sleeping systems. Fishermen would stretch animal hides or woven mats between these points, creating primitive sleeping platforms that kept them off the wet deck floor. This is important because it reveals something crucial about human nature. Even in the most basic survival situations, people immediately start trying to improve their sleep. Not their food, not their safety, not their tools, their sleep. It's as if our brains are hardwired to prioritize rest, even when everything else is falling apart. The word hammock itself tells us a story about cultural collision and adaptation. It comes from the Taíno word hamaca, which Spanish explorers encountered in the Caribbean in the late 1400s. The Taíno people had perfected the art of sleeping in woven nets suspended between trees. And when Europeans saw this, they immediately recognized its potential for shipboard use. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Spanish didn't just adopt hammocks wholesale. They modified them, adapted them, and eventually created something quite different from the original Taíno design. The indigenous hammocks were wide, comfortable, meant for leisurely rest in stable environments. The ship versions became narrow, utilitarian, designed to save space and prevent people from falling out during storms. The earliest ship hammocks were actually more like sleeping bags with ropes attached. They wrapped around the sleeper almost completely, creating a cocoon effect that kept people secure even when the ship was pitching violently. This design detail is crucial to understanding pirate sleep, because it shows that from the very beginning, sleeping on ships was about survival first, comfort second. By the 1500s, when organized piracy was just beginning to emerge in the Caribbean, there were already established traditions about shipboard sleeping that had been developing for thousands of years. These weren't written rules. They were cultural knowledge passed down from sailor to sailor, port to port, ship to ship. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from a Spanish merchant ship that sank off the coast of Florida in 1622. When archaeologists excavated the wreck, they found something remarkable: the remains of sleeping areas that showed clear social hierarchies. The officers' quarters had proper hammock attachments and even primitive mattresses made of stuffed sailcloth. The crew areas had simple rope attachments and evidence of communal sleeping arrangements. But most telling of all, they found areas where there were no sleeping provisions at all. Spaces where people had clearly been sleeping directly on the deck, using whatever they could find for comfort. This gives us our first concrete evidence that even on legitimate merchant vessels, many crew members were sleeping in conditions that we would consider barely survivable. The transition from merchant sailor to pirate often happened gradually, and sleeping arrangements were one of the first things that changed. When a crew mutinied or a ship was captured, the new pirate crew would immediately redistribute sleeping privileges. The old hierarchy based on official rank would be replaced by a new one based on pirate values: fighting ability, useful skills, and seniority in the pirate community. We have a fascinating account from a Dutch sailor named Jan Erasmus Reining, who was captured by pirates in 1677 and later escaped. His journal, discovered in Amsterdam archives in the 1960s, provides some of our most detailed early descriptions of pirate sleeping arrangements. He writes about the shock of discovering that on the pirate ship, sleeping spots were earned, not assigned. "The first night," he wrote, "I lay down where I thought appropriate, near the other common sailors. But I was quickly informed that this space belonged to Willem the carpenter, who had been with the crew for 2 years. I was directed to a space near the bilge pumps, where the newest members were expected to sleep until they proved their worth." This account reveals something crucial. Pirate ships had their own internal logic about sleep, their own systems of fairness and hierarchy that were completely different from legitimate naval vessels. It wasn't chaos, it was a different kind of order, one based on contribution and survival rather than birth or official appointment. The archaeological evidence also shows us something surprising about the evolution of pirate sleeping arrangements. As piracy became more organized and successful in the late 1600s and early 1700s, pirate ships actually developed more sophisticated sleeping systems than many legitimate vessels. Successful pirate crews would capture multiple ships and have their pick of equipment. They'd take the best hammocks, the most comfortable bedding, the most practical sleeping gear from every vessel they captured. Some pirate ships ended up with better sleeping arrangements than naval vessels simply because they had access to the combined resources of dozens of captured ships. But this luxury was always temporary and always precarious. A single bad storm, a failed raid, or a successful naval attack could strip away all these accumulated comforts in a matter of hours. Pirates learned to sleep lightly, not just because of the physical conditions, but because comfort itself was always just one disaster away from disappearing completely. The earliest pirate codes, those written agreements that governed pirate crews, almost always included specific rules about sleeping arrangements. The Code of Captain Bartholomew Roberts, written in 1721, includes the line, "Every man shall have an equal vote in affairs of moment, but the captain shall have authority over quarters and rest." This seemingly simple statement actually reveals a complex understanding of how crucial sleep was to crew morale and ship function. What emerges from all this early evidence is a picture of sleeping on pirate ships as a constantly evolving adaptation to impossible circumstances. It wasn't a fixed system or a romantic tradition. It was an ongoing experiment in human survival, with each crew, each ship, each voyage developing its own solutions to the fundamental problem of how to rest when rest itself could be deadly. The story of how people slept on pirate ships is really the story of how power works when everything else falls apart. When you strip away governments, laws, social classes, and all the normal structures that determine who gets what, something fascinating happens. New power structures emerge almost immediately, and they always start with who gets to sleep where. Let's begin with the Spanish Empire, because their approach to shipboard hierarchy created the template that pirates would later both copy and rebel against. Spanish naval regulations from the 1500s were incredibly detailed about sleeping arrangements. The captain got a private cabin with a proper bed. Officers got smaller cabins with hammocks. Ordinary sailors got designated hammock space in the crew quarters. And at the bottom, there were always people who got nothing, usually pressed men, prisoners, or indigenous people forced into service. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about control. When you control where someone sleeps, you control their most vulnerable moments. You control their rest, their dreams, their ability to recover from the day's work. Spanish ship captains understood that sleeping arrangements were a form of power projection, a daily reminder of who mattered and who didn't. But here's where it gets interesting. When these same ships were captured by pirates, the sleeping hierarchy didn't disappear. It just got completely reorganized according to different values. Take the case of Captain Henry Morgan's fleet in the 1660s. Morgan was technically a privateer, operating with English government approval, but his crews were essentially pirates with paperwork. When they captured Spanish ships, one of the first things they did was redistribute sleeping space. But they didn't just give everyone equal access. Instead, they created a new hierarchy based on pirate values: fighting ability, useful skills, loyalty to the crew, and length of service. The ship's carpenter might get better sleeping quarters than a captured Spanish officer because the carpenter could keep the ship afloat. A skilled navigator might get hammock privileges over someone of higher social birth because navigation kept everyone alive. This was revolutionary thinking for the time. The idea that your value was determined by what you could do, not who your parents were. The Catholic Church played a fascinating role in shaping shipboard sleeping culture, though not in the way you might expect. Church doctrine held that sleep was a time of spiritual vulnerability, when the soul was closest to both God and the devil. This led to elaborate rituals around bedtime on Catholic ships: prayers, blessings, even specific sleeping positions that were considered more spiritually safe. Pirates, many of whom were fleeing religious persecution or simply rejecting organized religion entirely, turned these rituals upside down. Instead of prayers before sleep, they developed their own traditions: sharing rum, telling stories of successful raids, or simply acknowledging each other's survival of another day. Sleep became secular, communal, stripped of religious meaning, and transformed into something purely human. The English Navy's approach was different, but equally rigid. English naval regulations were obsessed with preventing what they called unnatural congress between sailors. This led to sleeping arrangements designed to minimize privacy and intimate contact. Hammocks were spaced precisely 14 inches apart. Crew members were forbidden from sharing sleeping space. There were even regulations about how hammocks should be hung to prevent them from swinging into each other. When English sailors turned pirate, these restrictions were among the first things to disappear. Pirate crews developed much more flexible, intimate sleeping arrangements. Men would share hammocks during cold weather, sleep in groups for warmth and protection, and generally treat physical closeness as a survival strategy rather than a moral threat. The Dutch approach was perhaps the most practical. Dutch merchant ships were designed for efficiency above all else, and this extended to sleeping arrangements. They developed modular hammock systems that could be quickly reconfigured based on cargo needs, weather conditions, or crew size. Dutch ships often had the most comfortable sleeping arrangements, but also the most utilitarian. Pirates learned from all of these traditions, but they also had to deal with a unique problem. Their crews were constantly changing. Unlike naval vessels with stable crews, pirate ships were always gaining and losing members. People joined after being captured, left when they reached friendly ports, died in battles, or simply decided pirate life wasn't for them. This constant turnover meant that sleeping arrangements had to be flexible and fair in ways that traditional ships never had to consider. Pirates developed sophisticated systems for integrating new crew members, for redistributing sleeping space when someone left or died, and for handling disputes over sleeping privileges. The most successful pirate captains understood that sleep was a form of currency. Captain Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was famous for using sleeping privileges as both reward and punishment. Crew members who performed well in battle might earn hammock privileges or better sleeping locations. Those who shirked their duties might find themselves sleeping on deck in all weather. But Blackbeard also understood something that many traditional naval officers missed. Fairness mattered more than hierarchy. His ship's articles included specific provisions for rotating sleeping privileges, ensuring that even the lowest crew members occasionally got access to better sleeping arrangements. This wasn't kindness, it was practical leadership. A crew that felt fairly treated was less likely to mutiny. The French brought their own cultural attitudes about sleep and privacy to piracy. French naval tradition emphasized individual sleeping space as a matter of personal dignity. Even common sailors on French ships typically had more privacy than their counterparts on English or Spanish vessels. When French sailors turned pirate, they often insisted on maintaining some version of this privacy, leading to creative solutions like hanging sailcloth curtains around sleeping areas or developing rotation systems that gave everyone occasional private sleep time. This cultural mixing created something entirely new in pirate crews. A single ship might have English sailors who were used to communal sleeping, Spanish sailors accustomed to rigid hierarchy, French sailors expecting privacy, Dutch sailors focused on efficiency, and indigenous Caribbean people with completely different concepts of rest and community. The sleeping arrangements that emerged from this cultural collision were unlike anything that existed on traditional ships. The most fascinating power dynamic involved what pirates called sleep debt. On legitimate naval vessels, sleep was regulated by watch schedules and official duties. But on pirate ships, sleep became a form of social currency that could be traded, borrowed, and accumulated. If you took someone's watch duty so they could sleep, they owed you sleep time later. If you gave up your hammock to someone who was sick or injured, you earned social credit that could be redeemed for better sleeping arrangements in the future. Some pirates became skilled at managing these sleep debts, building networks of mutual obligation that gave them influence far beyond their official role on the ship. The quartermaster, the pirate officer responsible for discipline and resource distribution, often spent more time managing sleeping arrangements than any other single duty. Successful quartermasters developed elaborate systems for tracking who slept where, when, and under what conditions. They mediated disputes over sleeping space, enforced fairness rules, and made the daily decisions about how to accommodate new crew members or redistribute space when someone died. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of pirate sleeping culture was how it handled the ultimate power dynamic, the relationship between officers and crew. On traditional ships, officers slept separately, ate separately, and lived in a completely different world from ordinary sailors. Pirates maintained some hierarchy. Captains usually had private sleeping quarters, but the barriers were much more permeable. Many pirate captains would occasionally sleep on deck with their crews, especially during difficult voyages or after successful raids. This wasn't just symbolic, it was practical leadership. A captain who understood the actual sleeping conditions of his crew could make better decisions about everything from watch schedules to battle tactics. The most successful pirate crews developed what we might recognize today as democratic sleeping policies. Major decisions about sleeping arrangements were made by crew vote. Disputes were resolved through established procedures rather than arbitrary captain's orders. And perhaps most importantly, the basic principle was established that everyone deserved rest, regardless of their background, skills, or social status. This democratic approach to sleep had profound implications beyond just comfort. When you establish that everyone has an equal right to rest, you're making a fundamental statement about human dignity and worth. Pirates, often without realizing it, were developing political philosophies that wouldn't become mainstream for another century or more. The transformation of sleeping arrangements from tools of control to expressions of equality represents one of the most significant ways that pirate culture challenged the power structures of their time. They took something as basic as where you lay your head at night and turned it into a statement about how human societies could be organized differently. And this brings us to a crucial understanding. The way pirates slept wasn't just an adaptation to physical conditions on ships. It was a rejection of the entire social order that had shaped their previous lives, and an experiment in creating something new. Every night, as these men and women found their places to rest, they were participating in a quiet revolution that challenged everything their world believed about power, hierarchy, and human worth. Let me take you through a single night on a pirate ship, not as an observer, but as someone living it, feeling it, surviving it. Close your eyes and imagine you're Thomas Whitmore, a former English sailor who joined Captain Samuel Bellamy's crew in 1717. You've been a pirate for 8 months now, and tonight, like every night, you're facing the challenge of finding rest in a world that seems designed to prevent it. The sun disappeared an hour ago, and already the temperature below deck is dropping. During the day, the space between decks was an oven, so hot that men would strip to their waist and still drip sweat constantly. Now, as Caribbean night settles over the water, that same space is becoming a cold, damp cave that seems to suck the warmth from your bones. You're wearing the same clothes you've worn for 6 weeks now. Your shirt, once white, is now a grayish-brown color that comes from salt, sweat, tar, and stains you prefer not to think about. The fabric is stiff with dried salt water and has developed a smell that you've stopped noticing, though newcomers to the ship still gag when they get close to you. Your stomach is cramping slightly from tonight's dinner, a piece of salt pork that was probably already spoiled when you ate it, mixed with hardtack biscuits so infested with weevils that you've learned to eat them in the dark so you can't see the insects. The water you drank with dinner tasted like the inside of a wooden barrel that's been sitting in the sun for months, because that's exactly what it was. As you make your way below deck, the smell hits you like a physical wall. It's a combination of unwashed human bodies, rotting wood, stagnant bilge water, and the lingering odor of the ship's waste bucket, which sits just a few feet from where people sleep. Your eyes water slightly, but you've learned to breathe through your mouth to minimize the impact. The space below deck is about as large as a modern 2-car garage, but it needs to accommodate 47 men tonight. There are no separate rooms, no privacy, no personal space. It's just one large, low-ceilinged area filled with barrels, ropes, spare sails, weapons, and human bodies trying to find places to rest. You can hear Willem the carpenter coughing again, that wet, rattling cough that's been getting worse for weeks. Everyone knows what that cough means, but no one talks about it. In a few weeks, maybe a month, Willem will be dead, and someone else will inherit his sleeping spot near the water barrels. That's how it works. Death creates opportunity, and everyone pretends not to notice. Your usual sleeping spot is wedged between a cannon and a pile of spare sailcloth, near the ship's side where you can sometimes feel a slight breeze through the gaps in the planking. It's not much, but it's yours by right of 8 months' seniority and the fact that you once saved the life of Marcus the gunner, who vouched for your claim to this particular piece of deck space. But tonight, your spot is occupied. A new crew member, a Spanish sailor captured 3 days ago who decided to join rather than be marooned, is curled up exactly where you usually sleep. He's young, maybe 16, and he's shivering despite the warmth. You can see the fear in his eyes as he watches you approach. This is the moment that defines pirate social dynamics. You could assert your seniority, demand your spot, and force the newcomer to find somewhere else to sleep. You have that right. But you also remember your first night on this ship, when you were the terrified newcomer, and how grateful you were when an older pirate named Black Sam made room for you near his sleeping area. Instead, you settle down next to the Spanish boy, close enough that you can share body heat, but not so close as to make him more uncomfortable than he already is. You don't speak. He probably doesn't understand English anyway. But you position yourself between him and the more aggressive crew members, a subtle signal that he's under your protection for tonight. The deck beneath you is hard oak planking, worn smooth by years of foot traffic, but still unforgiving against your hip bones and shoulders. You've learned to sleep on your side, knees drawn up, one arm folded under your head as a pillow. Your other arm stays free, resting on the knife at your belt, because even among your crewmates, you never know when someone might decide that your possessions are worth more than your friendship. As the ship moves through the water, you feel every motion transmitted through the wooden hull into your body. The ship doesn't rock gently, it lurches, rolls, and pitches unpredictably. One moment you're pressed against the cannon by your side, the next you're sliding toward the center of the deck. You've developed an unconscious ability to brace yourself against these movements, tensing and relaxing your muscles in rhythm with the ship's motion, even while asleep. The sounds around you are constant and varied. There's the creaking of the ship's timbers, a sound like a giant wooden instrument being slowly played. Water sloshes in the bilge below, and you can hear rats scurrying through the walls, their claws scratching against wood. Someone near the bow is snoring loudly, probably Jenkins, who always snores when he's been drinking rum. Someone else is muttering in his sleep, reliving some dream or nightmare. Occasionally, you hear footsteps on the deck above as the night watch moves around, checking the sails and watching for other ships. These sounds are comforting because they mean everything is normal, that no one is shouting about storms or enemy vessels. Your body aches in ways that have become so familiar you barely notice them anymore. Your back is constantly sore from sleeping on hard surfaces. Your joints are stiff from the damp air and the awkward positions you sleep in. Your hands are permanently cracked and calloused from rope work, and they sting slightly from the salt that's worked its way into every small cut and scrape. But there's also a strange comfort in this discomfort. You've learned that you can endure far more than you ever thought possible. You've discovered that the human body can adapt to almost anything, that sleep will come eventually, no matter how uncomfortable you are, and that tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. As you drift towards sleep, your mind wanders to the life you left behind. You remember sleeping in a real bed, between clean sheets, in a room with windows and privacy. That life seems like something that happened to someone else, a story you heard rather than something you actually experienced. But you also remember why you left that life. The grinding poverty, the hopelessness, the certainty that you would die in the same miserable circumstances where you were born. Here, on this floating wooden prison, you have something you never had before, the possibility that tomorrow might be different, that the next ship you capture might contain enough treasure to change your life forever. The Spanish boy next to you has stopped shivering and his breathing has become regular. He's fallen asleep, probably for the first time in 3 days. You feel a strange sense of satisfaction at having provided this small comfort to someone even more desperate than yourself. Your own breathing slows, and you feel consciousness beginning to slip away. But even as you fall asleep, part of your mind remains alert, listening for changes in the ship's motion, for unusual sounds, for anything that might signal danger. This is the pirate's sleep, never complete, never entirely safe, but somehow, against all odds, still restorative. In a few hours, you'll wake up stiff, sore, and probably still tired. But you'll also wake up free, part of a crew that answers to no king, no master, no authority except the ones they choose for themselves. And for now, in this moment between waking and sleeping, that freedom feels worth every discomfort, every danger, every night spent sleeping on the hard deck of a ship sailing toward an uncertain dawn. There's one object that appears in every single account of pirate sleeping arrangements, mentioned in ship inventories, described in survivor testimonies, and found in shipwreck excavations across 3 centuries of maritime history. It's not what you'd expect. It's not hammocks or blankets or pillows. It's a simple wooden bucket. But this wasn't just any bucket. Pirates called it the sleep bucket, and understanding what it meant to them reveals something profound about how human beings create dignity and community even in the most degraded circumstances. The sleep bucket started as pure necessity. On any ship, you need containers for water, for food storage, for bailing out bilge water. But pirates discovered that a bucket could serve another crucial function. It could define personal space in a world where personal space didn't exist. Picture this. You're trying to sleep on a crowded deck with 40 other men. There are no walls, no barriers, no way to mark where your space ends and someone else's begins. But if you place a bucket next to where you sleep, suddenly you have a boundary. It's not much, but it's something. The bucket becomes a tiny fortress, a claim to a few square feet of deck space. But the sleep bucket evolved into something much more complex than just a space marker. Pirates began using their buckets to store their most precious possessions, not treasure, but the small personal items that made life bearable. A letter from home, if they could read. A lucky coin. A piece of soap saved for special occasions. Maybe a small knife for eating or a needle and thread for mending clothes. The bucket became a portable home, the only private space a pirate could truly call his own. And because it was portable, it could move with him if he changed ships, if he was transferred to a different crew, or if sleeping arrangements were reorganized. In a world where everything else was communal and temporary, the sleep bucket represented continuity and individual identity. The social rules around sleep buckets were incredibly complex and strictly enforced. You never, ever touched another man's bucket without permission. Even looking through someone's bucket was considered a serious violation that could lead to violence. The bucket and its contents were sacred in a way that nothing else on the ship was sacred. When a pirate died, the distribution of his sleep bucket was a major social event. The bucket itself might go to a friend or someone who had done the deceased a favor, but the contents were usually distributed according to elaborate protocols that varied from ship to ship. Some crews held auctions, with the proceeds going to the dead man's family if he had one. Others distributed items based on need or seniority. The bucket also served practical sleeping functions that reveal the ingenuity of people adapting to impossible circumstances. Turned upside down, it became a pillow. Not comfortable, but better than nothing. Filled with warm water from the galley, it became a heating device that could warm a sleeping area for hours. Covered with sailcloth, it became a small table for eating or writing. But perhaps most importantly, the bucket served as a chamber pot during the night. This might seem crude, but it was actually a sophisticated solution to a serious problem. Getting up in the middle of the night to use the ship's head, the toilet area at the bow, was dangerous, disruptive, and often impossible during storms. The sleep bucket allowed pirates to relieve themselves without disturbing others or risking injury in the dark. The morning ritual of emptying and cleaning sleep buckets was one of the first communal activities of each day. Pirates would line up at the ship's rail, empty their buckets overboard, and rinse them with seawater. This wasn't just hygiene, it was a daily affirmation of community, a shared acknowledgement that everyone had the same basic human needs and dignity. Different pirate crews developed different traditions around sleep buckets. Some crews painted their buckets with personal symbols or colors. Others carved initials or meaningful dates into the wood. A few crews developed elaborate decorative traditions, with buckets becoming canvases for folk art that expressed individual personality and crew identity. The quality and condition of a pirate's sleep bucket often reflected his status within the crew. New members might get old, cracked buckets that leaked or had broken handles. Senior crew members might have well-maintained buckets with tight-fitting lids and smooth, worn handles that felt comfortable to carry. The ship's carpenter might even customize buckets for favored crew members, adding compartments or special features. But the sleep bucket also reveals something darker about pirate life. In accounts from captured pirates, interrogators often noted that men would become extremely agitated when separated from their buckets. Some pirates would refuse to cooperate with authorities until their buckets were returned. Others would become violent if their buckets were searched or confiscated. This wasn't just attachment to possessions. It was the psychological response of people whose entire sense of self had been compressed into a single portable container. The bucket represented not just their belongings, but their identity, their dignity, their claim to being human beings, rather than just bodies taking up space on a ship. The evolution of the sleep bucket also tells us about the economics of pirate life. Early pirates often used whatever containers they could find: captured buckets from merchant ships, improvised containers made from barrels or crates. But as piracy became more organized and profitable, some crews began commissioning custom-made sleep buckets from craftsmen in pirate-friendly ports. These custom buckets were works of art, carefully crafted from the best available wood, with tight-fitting joints that wouldn't leak, comfortable handles, and sometimes even decorative metalwork. A well-made sleep bucket could last for years and was often a pirate's most valuable possession, worth more to him than weapons or jewelry. The bucket tradition also spread beyond piracy into other maritime communities. Merchant sailors, naval crews, and even passengers on long voyages began adopting versions of the sleep bucket system. But it never had quite the same significance in these more structured environments, where people had other ways to establish identity and claim space. When the golden age of piracy ended in the 1720s, the sleep bucket tradition largely disappeared from maritime culture. Modern ships had better storage systems, more organized sleeping arrangements, and different approaches to privacy and personal space. But for nearly a century, this simple wooden container had served as the foundation of an entire social system, a way for desperate people to maintain their humanity in inhuman conditions. Today, when we find sleep buckets in shipwreck excavations, they're often the most poignant artifacts we recover. Unlike weapons or treasure, which tell us about violence and greed, the sleep bucket tells us about the quiet, daily struggle to remain human. It reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, people find ways to create meaning, establish dignity, and build community around the simplest objects. The sleep bucket represents something universal about human nature, our need for a place that belongs to us, no matter how small, no matter how humble. In a world where pirates had given up almost everything, their countries, their families, their legal identities, the sleep bucket remained theirs, a tiny island of personal sovereignty in an ocean of chaos. There's a myth about pirate ships that they were floating democracies where everyone was equal, where the rigid class systems of land-based society simply melted away in the face of shared danger and adventure. This myth is particularly strong when it comes to sleeping arrangements, the idea that pirates all slept together in egalitarian brotherhood, sharing the same hardships and the same simple accommodations. The reality was far more complex and far more human. Pirate ships had their own intricate social hierarchies, their own systems of privilege and exclusion, their own ways of determining who mattered and who didn't. And nowhere were these divisions more visible than in who slept where, when, and how. Let's start with the most obvious divide: officers versus crew. Even on the most democratic pirate ships, the captain usually had private sleeping quarters. But this wasn't just about comfort, it was about the practical necessities of command. The captain needed space for charts, for private meetings, for the kind of decision-making that couldn't happen in front of the entire crew. But here's where pirate culture differed from legitimate naval vessels. The captain's sleeping privileges were conditional. They depended on the crew's continued confidence in his leadership. A captain who made bad decisions, who failed to capture prizes, or who treated the crew unfairly could find himself voted out of his position and out of his private sleeping quarters. The quartermaster, the officer responsible for discipline and resource distribution, occupied a unique position in the sleeping hierarchy. On many ships, the quartermaster actually had more influence over daily sleeping arrangements than the captain. He decided disputes over sleeping space, managed the rotation of hammock privileges, and enforced the unwritten rules that governed nighttime behavior. But the quartermaster's power came with a price. He was often the most hated man on the ship, because he was the one who had to make the hard decisions about who got what. When there weren't enough hammocks to go around, when someone had to sleep in the worst spots, when conflicts arose over sleeping space, the quartermaster was the one who had to choose sides and enforce unpopular decisions. The ship's specialists, the carpenter, the navigator, the surgeon, the gunner, formed their own tier in the sleeping hierarchy. These men had skills that were essential to the ship's survival, and their sleeping arrangements reflected their value. They might not get private quarters, but they usually got hammock privileges, better sleeping locations, and protection from the worst sleeping conditions. But this created its own tensions. A skilled carpenter might sleep more comfortably than a brave fighter who had risked his life in multiple battles. A navigator who had never fired a shot in anger might have better sleeping arrangements than a veteran pirate who had been with the crew for years. These contradictions created constant friction and required careful management by the ship's leadership. The divide between veterans and newcomers was perhaps the most rigid of all. New crew members, whether they joined voluntarily or were pressed into service, started at the bottom of the sleeping hierarchy. They got the worst spots, the most uncomfortable positions, the least protection from weather and ship's motion. But this wasn't just hazing or cruelty. It was a practical system for managing trust and loyalty. New crew members hadn't proven themselves yet. They might be spies, they might desert at the first opportunity, they might even try to sabotage the ship. Keeping them in uncomfortable, visible sleeping positions allowed the veteran crew to monitor them and assess their commitment to pirate life. The process of moving up in the sleeping hierarchy was complex and often took months or even years. It required not just competence and loyalty, but also the ability to navigate the ship's social dynamics. A newcomer had to find a sponsor among the veteran crew, someone willing to vouch for him and help him earn better sleeping privileges. Age created another layer of social division. Older pirates, especially those who had been successful in their careers, often received sleeping privileges that reflected their experience and accumulated wealth. But age could also be a liability. Pirates who were too old to fight effectively, who couldn't perform their share of the ship's work, might find their sleeping privileges gradually eroded as younger, stronger crew members displaced them. The most invisible, but perhaps most important divide was between those who could read and those who couldn't. Literacy was rare among pirates, but those who possessed it had enormous advantages. They could read charts, interpret captured documents, and communicate with other ships and ports. This intellectual value often translated into better sleeping arrangements, even for pirates who weren't physically strong or particularly brave. But literacy also created suspicion. Pirates who could read and write were often suspected of having connections to legitimate society, of being potential informants or spies. Their sleeping arrangements might be comfortable, but they were also carefully monitored. Literate pirates often found themselves sleeping near the ship's officers, where their activities could be observed and their loyalty assessed. The divide between those who had families and those who didn't created another layer of complexity. Pirates with wives, children, or other dependents often sent money home and maintained connections to legitimate society. This made them valuable for certain kinds of operations. They could move freely in ports, gather information, and conduct business transactions. But it also made them suspect. Pirates with outside loyalties might be tempted to betray the crew, to cooperate with authorities, or to abandon pirate life when it became too dangerous. Their sleeping arrangements often reflected this ambivalence, comfortable enough to keep them loyal, but positioned where they could be watched and controlled. Perhaps the most tragic divide was between those who had chosen pirate life and those who had been forced into it. Many pirate crews included men who had been captured from merchant ships, pressed into service, or who had joined only to avoid being killed or marooned. These reluctant pirates often found themselves in a permanent underclass, never fully trusted, never fully accepted, always sleeping in the worst conditions. But even among the reluctant pirates, there were gradations. A captured ship's officer might be treated better than a common sailor because his skills were more valuable. A young man who adapted quickly to pirate life might earn better treatment than an older man who clearly resented his circumstances. The sleeping hierarchy reflected these subtle distinctions, creating a complex map of value, trust, and social position. The most surprising divide was often between pirates from different national backgrounds. English pirates might cluster together in one part of the ship, Spanish pirates in another, French pirates in a third. These ethnic sleeping arrangements weren't necessarily hostile. They often reflected language barriers, cultural differences, and the comfort of sleeping near people who shared your background. But they also created opportunities for conflict and manipulation. A clever captain might deliberately mix sleeping arrangements to prevent the formation of ethnic factions that could challenge his authority. Or he might use ethnic divisions to his advantage, playing different groups against each other to maintain control. What emerges from all these divisions is a picture of pirate ships as complex social organisms, constantly negotiating questions of value, loyalty, trust, and belonging. The sleeping arrangements weren't just about physical comfort. They were a daily map of the ship's social structure, a visible representation of who mattered and who didn't. And yet, for all these divisions and hierarchies, there was something genuinely different about pirate society. The sleeping arrangements might be unequal, but they were also fluid. A man could improve his position through courage, skill, loyalty, or luck. The hierarchies were based on contribution and merit, rather than birth or inherited status. Most importantly, even the lowest-ranking pirate had something that most people in legitimate society didn't have: the possibility of change. Tomorrow's raid might make him rich. Next week's battle might prove his courage. Next month's voyage might elevate him to a position of respect and comfort. The sleeping arrangements on pirate ships reflected this fundamental difference. They were hierarchical but not permanent, unequal but not hopeless. They represented a society that was still brutal and unfair, but also one where a man's position depended on what he did rather than who he was born to be. Here's the moment where everything you think you know about pirate sleeping arrangements completely falls apart. Are you ready for this? Because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you picture life on these ships, and it's going to sound so strange that you might not believe it at first. Most pirates didn't sleep at night. Let that sink in for a moment. All those images of pirates tucking into hammocks after sunset, all those stories of nighttime rest and peaceful slumber under the stars, they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how time worked on pirate ships. Pirates slept during the day. This isn't a minor detail or a quirky historical footnote. This is a complete reversal of everything we assume about pirate life, and it happened for reasons that reveal just how different their world was from anything we can easily imagine. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources that historians have only recently begun to piece together properly. Ship logs from captured pirate vessels, when they exist, show activity patterns that are the reverse of what we'd expect. Testimony from captured pirates consistently describes daytime sleeping and nighttime activity. Even the design of pirate ships, when we look at it carefully, makes more sense if we assume that most of the crew was awake during the night hours. But why? Why would pirates choose to live their lives backwards, sleeping when the sun was up and staying awake in the darkness? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of pirate life that completely changes how we understand their daily existence. Pirates were, fundamentally, predators. And like most predators, they were most active during the hours when their prey was most vulnerable. Merchant ships, The primary targets of pirate attacks followed predictable patterns. They sailed during daylight hours when navigation was easier and safer. They anchored or reduced sail at night to avoid running aground or colliding with obstacles they couldn't see. Most importantly, merchant ship crews were least alert during the pre-dawn hours, when human circadian rhythms naturally create a period of reduced vigilance. Pirates learned to exploit these patterns. They would spend daylight hours sleeping, hidden in coves or sailing at a distance from shipping lanes. Then, as darkness fell, they would become active, hunting for targets, positioning themselves for dawn attacks, or moving into position to intercept merchant vessels at their most vulnerable moments. This nocturnal lifestyle had profound implications for sleeping arrangements that we've completely missed in our romanticized versions of pirate life. When pirates did sleep, they were sleeping during the hottest part of the day, in tropical climates, on ships with no air conditioning or effective ventilation. Imagine trying to sleep below deck on a wooden ship in the Caribbean sun. The temperature could easily reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the enclosed spaces where pirates had to rest. The air was so thick and stifling that men would literally pass out from heat exhaustion. The wooden decks became so hot that they would burn bare skin on contact. This is why so many pirate sleeping innovations focused on heat management rather than comfort. Pirates developed techniques for creating airflow in enclosed spaces, for using wet sailcloth as cooling systems, for positioning themselves to take advantage of any available breeze. They learned to sleep in positions that minimized contact with hot surfaces, and they developed clothing strategies that provided protection from heat while still allowing for some cooling. The social dynamics of daytime sleeping were also completely different from nighttime rest. During the day, there was always activity on the ship: maintenance work, sail repair, weapon cleaning, food preparation. Pirates had to learn to sleep through constant noise and movement in spaces that were being used for other purposes. This created a completely different set of social rules around sleep. Daytime sleepers had to be more tolerant of disturbance, more flexible about their sleeping locations, more willing to share space with ongoing activities. The rigid sleeping hierarchies that we might expect were softened by the practical necessities of daytime rest. But the most profound implication of daytime sleeping was psychological. Sleeping during the day, especially in hot, uncomfortable conditions, produces a different kind of rest than nighttime sleep. It's more fragmented, less restorative, more prone to interruption. Pirates were operating in a state of chronic partial sleep deprivation that affected everything from their decision-making to their emotional stability. This sleep deprivation helps explain some of the more extreme behaviors associated with pirate culture. The sudden violence, the poor long-term planning, the tendency toward impulsive decisions. These weren't just products of lawless culture, they were also symptoms of people who weren't getting proper rest. The reversal of day and night also meant that pirates experienced the ocean in a completely different way than we imagine. Instead of sailing under sunny skies and resting under starlit nights, they spent their active hours in darkness, navigating by feel and sound and instinct. They knew the ocean as a nighttime environment, full of invisible dangers and hidden opportunities. This nocturnal perspective influenced everything about pirate culture, from their navigation techniques to their spiritual beliefs. Many pirate superstitions and rituals were specifically adapted to nighttime life: ways of reading weather patterns in darkness, techniques for silent communication, methods for maintaining morale during the long, dark hours of hunting and waiting. The transition between day and night became one of the most important times in the pirate daily cycle. As the sun set and the crew prepared for their active period, there were rituals and preparations that served the same function as morning routines in normal society. Pirates would eat their main meal, check their weapons, review plans for the night's activities, and mentally prepare for whatever dangers or opportunities the darkness might bring. Similarly, dawn wasn't the beginning of the pirate day, it was the end. As the sun rose, pirates would secure their ships, count their gains or losses from the night's activities, and begin the process of settling down for daytime rest. The morning hours were often when the most important social interactions took place, as the crew processed the events of the night and prepared for sleep. This reversal also affected how pirates related to the natural world. They became experts at reading nighttime weather patterns, at navigating by stars, at detecting the approach of other ships through sound and subtle changes in wind patterns. They developed an intimate knowledge of how the ocean behaved in darkness, knowledge that was completely different from the daytime seamanship practiced by legitimate sailors. The implications extend even to how we understand pirate economics and social organization. Raids and attacks that happened at dawn weren't the result of early rising. They were the culmination of all-night preparations and positioning. The famous pirate practice of appearing out of nowhere at sunrise makes perfect sense when we realize that they had been moving into position all night while their targets slept. This nocturnal lifestyle also helps explain why pirate crews were often smaller and more tightly knit than the crews of legitimate ships. Operating effectively in darkness requires higher levels of coordination, communication, and trust. Every crew member had to be more skilled, more reliable, more attuned to the subtle cues that meant the difference between success and disaster in nighttime operations. The revelation that pirates were primarily nocturnal creatures changes everything about how we understand their sleeping arrangements, their social dynamics, their relationship with the ocean, and their methods of survival. It transforms them from the daylight adventurers of popular imagination into something more like maritime wolves, pack hunters who owned the darkness and used the night as their primary weapon against a world that had rejected them. And it makes their sleeping arrangements not just a matter of comfort or social organization, but a crucial adaptation to a way of life that was fundamentally different from anything else in their world. When we understand that pirates were sleeping during the day in impossible heat while maintaining constant readiness for nighttime action, their innovations in rest and recovery become not just interesting historical details, but remarkable examples of human adaptation to extreme circumstances. In the strange, inverted world of pirate ships, where day became night and night became day, where sleep happened under the blazing sun and wakefulness belonged to darkness, rituals around rest took on an almost sacred significance. These weren't the formal, religious ceremonies you might expect, but something more primal. Repeated actions that helped maintain sanity and humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to strip both away. The most universal ritual was what pirates called the settling. As the sun climbed higher and the ship found its resting position for the day, crew members would begin a slow, methodical process of preparing for sleep that was part practical necessity and part psychological comfort. First came the claiming of space. This wasn't a chaotic scramble, but a careful, almost choreographed sequence where each pirate moved to his designated sleeping area according to the complex social hierarchies we've discussed. But within this structure, there were small personal rituals that each man performed to mark his territory and prepare his mind for rest. Some pirates would arrange their few possessions in exactly the same pattern every day. Sleep bucket positioned just so, knife placed at a specific angle, any personal items arranged in a particular order. These arrangements served no practical purpose, but they created a sense of control and familiarity in an environment where almost nothing could be controlled or predicted. Others developed elaborate routines around their clothing. They might remove their shirt and hang it in exactly the same way each day, or adjust their belt to a specific position, or arrange their boots in a particular pattern. These small acts of self-care and organization became anchors of identity in a world where individual identity was constantly under threat. The most poignant ritual involved what pirates called the remembering. Before settling down to sleep, many pirates would spend a few minutes in quiet contemplation, often holding some small personal item, a coin, a piece of cloth, a carved wooden token. They weren't praying exactly, but they were connecting with something beyond their immediate circumstances. Some were remembering family members they'd left behind. Others were thinking about the life they'd abandoned or the future they hoped to create. A few were simply trying to hold on to some sense of who they had been before they became pirates. These moments of remembering served as a daily affirmation that they were still human beings with histories and hopes, not just bodies occupying space on a ship. The ship's cook often played a crucial role in sleep rituals. In the hour before the crew settled down for daytime rest, he would prepare what pirates called sleep tea, usually just hot water with whatever herbs or spices were available, but sometimes enhanced with a small amount of rum or other alcohol. This wasn't about getting drunk. It was about creating a moment of warmth and comfort that helped ease the transition from the active night to the restful day. The distribution of sleep tea became its own ritual. The cook would move through the ship with a large pot and a collection of mismatched cups, serving each crew member in order of seniority. But even this hierarchy had its own flexibility. Sick crew members might be served first, regardless of rank, and newcomers were always included, even if they had to wait until last. The act of drinking sleep tea together created a brief moment of community and shared experience. For a few minutes, the ship would be filled with the quiet sounds of men sipping hot liquid, perhaps sharing a few words about the night's activities or the day's plans. It was one of the few times when the entire crew was together in a peaceful, non-working context. Weather rituals were particularly important because they directly affected sleeping comfort and safety. Pirates developed elaborate methods for predicting how the day's weather would affect their rest. They would check wind direction, cloud patterns, and sea conditions, then adjust their sleeping arrangements accordingly. If storms were expected, crew members would secure their possessions more carefully and choose sleeping positions that offered better protection from wind and rain. If the day was going to be particularly hot, they would arrange sailcloth to create shade and position themselves to take advantage of any available breeze. These weather preparations weren't just practical, they were also psychological. The act of preparing for known challenges helped pirates feel more in control of their circumstances. Even if they couldn't prevent discomfort, they could at least anticipate it and take steps to minimize its impact. The most complex rituals involved the management of shared sleeping spaces. When multiple pirates had to sleep in close proximity, they developed elaborate protocols for minimizing conflict and maximizing comfort for everyone involved. There were rules about movement during sleep, how to turn over without disturbing your neighbors, how to get up for necessary activities without waking others, how to deal with snoring or other disruptive behaviors. These rules weren't written down anywhere, but they were passed from veteran crew members to newcomers through demonstration and gentle correction. Some crews developed rotation systems that ensured everyone occasionally got access to the best sleeping spots. Others created partnerships where 2 or 3 pirates would work together to optimize their shared sleeping arrangements, taking turns providing comfort or protection for each other. The most touching rituals involved care for sick or injured crew members. Pirates might be ruthless in battle and harsh in their treatment of enemies, but they often showed remarkable tenderness toward crewmates who were suffering. Sick pirates would be given the best available sleeping positions, extra blankets or coverings, and protection from disturbance. Healthy crew members would take turns checking on sick comrades, bringing them water, adjusting their positions for comfort, or simply sitting with them during difficult periods. These acts of care weren't just kindness, they were investments in the crew's collective survival and expressions of the bonds that held pirate communities together. Death rituals were particularly important because death was such a constant presence on pirate ships. When a crew member died during the day while others were trying to sleep, there were specific protocols for handling the body and the deceased's possessions without disrupting the rest of the crew. The body would be moved to a designated area, usually near the ship's rail, and covered with sailcloth. The deceased's sleep bucket and personal items would be gathered and set aside for later distribution. But the actual funeral and distribution of possessions would wait until the crew's active period began at sunset. This delay served multiple purposes. It allowed the crew to process the death without disrupting necessary rest. It gave time for proper preparation of funeral rituals, and it ensured that important decisions about the deceased's possessions could be made when everyone was alert and able to participate. Perhaps the most important ritual was what pirates called the counting. Before settling down to sleep, crew members would mentally review the night's activities, counting their gains and losses, assessing their current situation, and planning for the future. This wasn't formal record keeping. Most pirates couldn't read or write well enough for that. Instead, it was a mental exercise that helped them maintain awareness of their circumstances and make better decisions about their survival and success. Some pirates would count money or treasure, if they had any. Others would count days since their last successful raid, or days until they planned to reach a friendly port. A few would count the crew members who were still alive and healthy, or the supplies that remained on the ship. The act of counting served as a form of meditation, a way of organizing thoughts and emotions before sleep. It helped pirates maintain perspective on their situation and avoid the kind of despair or panic that could be fatal in their dangerous circumstances. All of these rituals, the settling, the remembering, the sleep tea, the weather preparations, the care for others, the counting, served the same fundamental purpose. They created structure and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and meaningless. They helped maintain human dignity and community in circumstances that could easily have reduced people to mere survival machines. And they worked. Despite the impossible conditions, the constant danger, and the brutal realities of pirate life, these rituals helped create functioning communities that could survive for months or even years at sea. They transformed a collection of desperate individuals into crews that could work together, care for each other, and maintain hope for a better future. The power of these rituals lay not in their complexity or their religious significance, but in their repetition and their shared nature. Day after day, as the sun rose and the crew prepared for rest, these small acts of humanity created the rhythm that made survival possible and gave meaning to lives that might otherwise have been consumed by despair. Let me tell you about the morning Thomas Whitmore woke up and couldn't feel his left arm. It was his 9th month aboard Captain Bellamy's ship, and he'd been sleeping wedged between a cannon and the ship's side, the same position he'd used for weeks. But this morning, his arm was completely numb from the shoulder down, and when he tried to move it, nothing happened. This wasn't unusual. Pirates regularly woke up with parts of their bodies that had simply stopped working temporarily: arms, legs, hands, feet that had been compressed or twisted during sleep until circulation stopped and nerves shut down. They called it ship sleep, and it was just one of the many ways that trying to rest on a pirate vessel slowly destroyed the human body. Thomas spent 20 minutes that morning massaging his arm, flexing his fingers, trying to restore feeling and movement. Around him, other crew members were going through their own morning rituals of physical recovery, stretching cramped muscles, working out kinks in their backs, testing joints that had been twisted into unnatural positions during the night. This was the reality of sleeping on pirate ships that no romantic story ever captures. It was a form of slow-motion torture that gradually broke down the human body in ways that were often irreversible. The most immediate physical challenge was the constant pressure on bones and joints from sleeping on hard wooden surfaces. Pirates developed what we would now recognize as chronic pain conditions, persistent aches in their hips, shoulders, and ribs from months or years of sleeping without proper cushioning. But the pain was just the beginning. The awkward sleeping positions required by cramped quarters led to permanent changes in posture and movement. Many long-term pirates developed a characteristic hunched stance, with one shoulder higher than the other, curved spines, and a shuffling gait that reflected years of sleeping curled up in impossible positions. The lack of proper rest also had profound effects on the immune system. Pirates were constantly sick with minor ailments that their bodies couldn't fight off effectively. They had persistent coughs, recurring fevers, skin infections that wouldn't heal, and digestive problems that were made worse by poor diet and contaminated water. Sleep deprivation affected their mental state in ways that were often more dangerous than physical ailments. Pirates operating on fragmented, insufficient rest became increasingly prone to poor judgment, sudden violence, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. The heat during daytime sleeping was particularly brutal on the human body. In tropical climates, the below-deck temperature could reach levels that were literally life-threatening. Pirates would wake up severely dehydrated, their bodies depleted of salt and essential minerals through constant sweating. Some never woke up at all. Heat exhaustion claimed lives regularly, and crew members would sometimes discover that a sleeping comrade had died quietly during the hottest part of the day. The body's response to chronic heat exposure created its own set of problems. Pirates developed heat rashes that covered large portions of their bodies, painful skin conditions that made wearing clothes uncomfortable, but going without them impossible due to sun exposure. Their body's ability to regulate temperature became compromised, leaving them vulnerable to both overheating and sudden chills when weather conditions changed. But perhaps the most insidious physical challenge was the constant dampness. Everything on a ship was always slightly wet, from salt spray, from humidity, from condensation, from leaks that were impossible to completely seal. Pirates slept in damp clothes, on damp surfaces, surrounded by damp air that never fully dried. This persistent moisture created ideal conditions for fungal infections that could spread across the skin, between toes, in hair, and in other areas of the body. These infections were not just uncomfortable, they could become serious medical problems that weakened pirates and made them more susceptible to other diseases. The psychological impact of never being truly dry, never being truly clean, never being truly comfortable cannot be overstated. It created a constant low-level stress that wore down mental resilience and made every other challenge more difficult to bear. Fear was as much a part of pirate sleep as physical discomfort. Pirates slept knowing that they could wake up to battle, to storms, to fire, to any number of life-threatening emergencies. This constant state of alertness meant that they never achieved the deep, restorative sleep that human beings need for proper physical and mental health. Many pirates developed what we would now recognize as hypervigilance, an inability to fully relax even during rest periods. They would sleep with one hand on their weapons, with their ears constantly tuned for unusual sounds, with part of their consciousness always monitoring their environment for signs of danger. This hypervigilant sleep was exhausting in its own right. Pirates would wake up feeling as tired as when they went to sleep because their minds had never truly rested. Over time, this chronic exhaustion accumulated into a form of mental and physical breakdown that affected every aspect of their lives. The fear of disease was particularly acute because medical care on pirate ships was primitive at best. A simple infection could become life-threatening, a broken bone could leave a pirate permanently disabled, and any serious illness could result in being abandoned at the next port or simply thrown overboard if the crew decided the sick person was too much of a burden. Pirates slept knowing that their bodies were their only tools for survival and that any injury or illness could mean death. This knowledge created a constant anxiety that made restful sleep nearly impossible. They would lie awake worrying about every ache, every unusual sensation, every sign that their bodies might be failing them. The social dynamics of illness added another layer of fear. Pirates who showed signs of weakness or sickness could quickly find themselves at the bottom of the ship's hierarchy, losing access to better sleeping arrangements, better food, and the protection of their crewmates. This created pressure to hide illness and injury, which often made medical problems worse and more dangerous. Women who occasionally found themselves on pirate ships faced additional physical challenges that were rarely acknowledged or accommodated. The lack of privacy made basic bodily functions difficult and dangerous, and the physical demands of ship life were often incompatible with female physiology. The few women who survived long-term on pirate ships had to develop extraordinary physical and mental resilience. The aging process was accelerated dramatically by pirate life. Men who spent years sleeping in harsh conditions, fighting battles, and living under constant stress aged much faster than their counterparts on land. A pirate in his 30s might look and feel like a man in his 50s, with gray hair, missing teeth, scarred skin, and the bent posture of someone much older. But the human body's capacity for adaptation was also remarkable. Pirates who survived their first year often developed extraordinary tolerance for discomfort, pain, and physical hardship. They learned to sleep through conditions that would have seemed impossible when they first came aboard, and they developed physical and mental toughness that served them well in their dangerous profession. Some pirates even found ways to use their harsh sleeping conditions as a form of training. They would deliberately choose uncomfortable positions or challenging locations, building their tolerance for hardship and their ability to rest under any circumstances. This wasn't masochism. It was practical preparation for the even worse conditions they might face during battles, storms, or other emergencies. The most successful pirates learned to listen to their bodies with extraordinary sensitivity. They could detect the early signs of illness, injury, or exhaustion, and they knew how to modify their sleeping arrangements and daily routines to address problems before they became serious. This body awareness was often the difference between survival and death in an environment where medical help was rarely available. Pain became a constant companion that pirates learned to manage rather than eliminate. They developed techniques for sleeping through various types of discomfort, for positioning their bodies to minimize pain, and for using mental strategies to cope with physical suffering. Some became remarkably skilled at what we might now call pain management, using breathing techniques, meditation, and mental focus to maintain function despite significant physical problems. The relationship between physical suffering and mental resilience was complex. While the harsh conditions broke down many pirates physically and mentally, they also created a form of toughness that was difficult to achieve any other way. Pirates who survived years of brutal sleeping conditions often developed an almost superhuman ability to endure hardship and maintain hope in seemingly hopeless circumstances. But this resilience came at a cost. Many pirates became emotionally numb, unable to form close relationships or experience normal human emotions. The constant focus on physical survival left little energy for the emotional and spiritual aspects of human life that make existence meaningful beyond mere survival. The body's need for rest never disappeared, no matter how harsh the conditions became. Pirates who tried to push through exhaustion without adequate sleep often paid a terrible price, making fatal mistakes in judgment, succumbing to diseases their weakened immune systems couldn't fight, or simply collapsing from the accumulated stress of months or years without proper rest. Understanding the physical reality of sleeping on pirate ships helps us appreciate not just the hardships these men endured, but also the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and survival. Every morning that a pirate woke up alive was a small victory against forces that were constantly trying to kill him. Every night that he found a way to rest, even briefly and uncomfortably, was an act of defiance against a world that seemed designed to break him down. The human body, pushed to its limits and beyond, found ways to survive that seem almost miraculous from our comfortable modern perspective. And in that survival, in that daily struggle to rest and recover enough to face another day, we see something profound about the resilience of the human spirit and the lengths to which people will go to maintain their freedom, even when that freedom comes at an almost unbearable physical cost. By 1720, something fundamental was shifting in the world's oceans, and pirates could feel it in their bones before they could see it on the horizon. The changes came slowly at first, then all at once, transforming not just how pirates operated, but how they slept, how they lived, and ultimately, how they died. The first sign was the ships themselves. Merchant vessels began appearing with new designs, faster hulls, better armament, more organized crews. These weren't the lumbering, poorly defended cargo ships that had made piracy profitable for decades. These were vessels designed specifically to outrun or outfight pirates, and they changed the fundamental equation of maritime predation. For pirates, this meant longer chases, more dangerous battles, and fewer successful captures. But it also meant changes to their sleeping patterns that were subtle but profound. When raids became less frequent and less profitable, pirate crews had to stay at sea longer between successful attacks. The comfortable rhythm of raid, rest, and resupply was disrupted, replaced by extended periods of hunting with uncertain outcomes. Pirates found themselves sleeping in shifts more often, maintaining constant vigilance for the increasingly rare opportunities to capture prizes. The luxury of settled daytime sleep became less common as crews had to be ready to pursue targets at any hour. Sleep became more fragmented, more anxious, more focused on the possibility of sudden action. The British Navy's systematic campaign against piracy, beginning in earnest around 1715, introduced a new kind of fear into pirate sleeping arrangements. Naval vessels were actively hunting pirates now, using better intelligence, more sophisticated tactics, and superior firepower. Pirates could no longer assume that their hidden anchorages and remote sleeping spots were safe from discovery. This constant threat of naval attack changed how pirates chose their resting places. They began favoring locations that offered multiple escape routes, even if those locations were less comfortable for sleeping. They developed new protocols for posting sentries and maintaining watch schedules that ensured someone was always alert for approaching naval vessels. The psychological impact was enormous. Pirates who had once slept with the confidence that they controlled their environment now rested uneasily, knowing that well-armed naval ships might appear at any moment. Sleep became lighter, more interrupted, filled with the anxiety of hunted animals rather than the confidence of apex predators. The expansion of colonial governments throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast gradually eliminated the safe havens where pirates had once been able to rest and resupply. Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, Charleston in South Carolina, one by one, the pirate-friendly ports either fell under government control or were destroyed entirely. This meant that pirates had to spend longer periods at sea without access to fresh water, food, medical supplies, or the simple comfort of sleeping on solid ground. The extended voyages took a terrible toll on crew health and morale, and the sleeping conditions on ships became even more crucial to survival as alternatives disappeared. Pirates began modifying their ships more extensively to accommodate longer periods at sea. They developed better water storage systems, more efficient food preservation methods, and improved sleeping arrangements that could sustain crews for months without touching land. These modifications represented the kind of technological arms race between pirates and the changing world around them. The economic changes were perhaps the most fundamental of all. As legitimate trade became more organized and better protected, and as colonial governments offered more opportunities for legal employment, the pool of potential pirates began to shrink. Fewer desperate men were willing to risk the increasingly dangerous life of piracy when other options were available. This meant that pirate crews became smaller and more selective, but also more desperate. The men who continued to choose piracy despite the increasing risks were often those with the fewest alternatives, the most wanted criminals, the most desperate outcasts, the most committed enemies of legitimate society. These harder, more desperate crews created different sleeping dynamics. There was less tolerance for weakness, less patience with newcomers, less willingness to share resources or comfort. The communal aspects of pirate sleeping arrangements began to break down as survival became more individual and more brutal. The introduction of new navigation technologies, better charts, improved instruments, more accurate timekeeping, gave legitimate ships significant advantages over pirates. Merchant vessels could now plan more efficient routes, avoid known pirate hunting grounds, and coordinate with naval patrols in ways that had been impossible before. For pirates, this technological gap meant that their traditional advantages, local knowledge, surprise attacks, superior seamanship, were being eroded. They had to work harder for fewer rewards, and the stress of this changing equation affected every aspect of their lives, including their ability to rest and recover between operations. The legal changes were equally significant. New international agreements made it easier for governments to cooperate in hunting pirates, and new laws made piracy a capital offense, with few opportunities for pardon or clemency. The possibility of retirement or redemption, which had once made pirate life seem temporary and survivable, largely disappeared. This legal pressure created a sense of fatalism among pirate crews that affected their sleeping patterns and daily routines. When capture meant certain death, pirates began living with a different relationship to time and future planning. Sleep became less about recovery for tomorrow's activities and more about escape from an increasingly hopeless present. The cultural changes were perhaps the most subtle but also the most profound. The romantic image of pirates that would later dominate popular culture was already beginning to emerge in the 1720s, but the reality was becoming increasingly grim. As piracy became less profitable and more dangerous, it attracted fewer adventurers and more genuine criminals. The codes of conduct and democratic traditions that had characterized earlier pirate crews began to break down under the pressure of desperation and diminishing returns. Sleeping arrangements became more hierarchical, more brutal, more focused on individual survival rather than collective welfare. The end came suddenly for most pirate crews. Between 1718 and 1725, the major pirate captains were systematically hunted down and killed or captured. Blackbeard died in battle in 1718. Calico Jack was captured and hanged in 1720. Bartholomew Roberts was killed in battle in 1722. One by one, the leaders who had created and maintained pirate communities were eliminated. With their leaders gone and their safe havens destroyed, the remaining pirates faced impossible choices. Some tried to continue operating with smaller crews and reduced ambitions, but they found themselves sleeping in increasingly desperate circumstances, hiding in swamps, living in caves, or simply standing at sea until their ships fell apart around them. Others attempted to retire from piracy, but found that the world had changed too much to accommodate them. The skills that had made them successful pirates, violence, seamanship, survival in harsh conditions, were less valuable in a world that was becoming more organized, more lawful, and less tolerant of outlaws. A few managed to disappear into legitimate society, using their accumulated wealth to buy new identities and start over. But even these successful escapees carried the physical and psychological scars of their pirate years. The chronic pain from sleeping on hard surfaces, the hypervigilance that made normal sleep difficult, the social skills adapted to life or death situations rather than peaceful communities. The transformation of the maritime world between 1715 and 1730 represents one of the most dramatic shifts in the history of ocean travel. In just 15 years, the seas went from being dominated by pirates and other outlaws to being controlled by organized navies and legitimate commerce. The sleeping arrangements on pirate ships, which had evolved over decades to accommodate a particular way of life, suddenly became obsolete. The last generation of pirates found themselves trying to maintain their traditional sleeping patterns and social arrangements in a world that no longer supported their existence. They were like the last members of a dying species, clinging to behaviors and traditions that had once ensured survival, but now only hastened extinction. By 1730, the golden age of piracy was effectively over. The few remaining pirates were either dead, captured, or living in such reduced circumstances that they bore little resemblance to the powerful crews that had once terrorized the Caribbean. Their sleeping arrangements, once a complex system of social organization and survival adaptation, had become simply the desperate rest of hunted men with nowhere left to hide. The world had moved on, leaving behind only stories and legends of the men who had once slept on the rolling decks of pirate ships, dreaming of freedom and treasure while the ocean carried them toward an uncertain dawn. The reality of their sleeping arrangements, the discomfort, the ingenuity, the community, the desperation, faded into history, replaced by romantic myths that bore little resemblance to the truth of what it had really felt like to try to rest while living outside the law on the endless, unforgiving sea. In 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island, and with it, he accidentally created one of the most persistent lies in popular culture. In Stevenson's pirate ship, crew members sleep peacefully in hammocks, wake up refreshed for adventures, and treat their floating home as a kind of rustic but comfortable maritime hotel. Stevenson had never been on a pirate ship. He'd never even been on a long ocean voyage. He wrote his pirate sleeping scenes from the comfort of his study in Scotland, imagining what he thought pirate life might have been like based on romanticized naval accounts and his own desire to create an exciting but not too disturbing story for young readers. But Treasure Island became the template for every pirate story that followed, and its comfortable, sanitized version of shipboard sleeping became the truth that most people still believe today. Every movie, every children's book, every theme park ride that followed built on Stevenson's invented foundation, moving further and further away from the brutal reality we've been exploring. The Hollywood version of pirate sleeping arrangements, which crystallized in films like Captain Blood, 1935, and The Seahawk, 1940, took Stevenson's romanticization even further. Movie pirates sleep in clean hammocks in well-lit, spacious quarters. They wake up looking refreshed and handsome, ready for sword fights and romantic adventures. The sleeping areas look more like summer camps than the disease-ridden, overcrowded, stinking holes that real pirates endured. These movies had to create appealing sleeping arrangements because they were selling fantasy, not history. Audiences wanted to imagine themselves as pirates, and that fantasy required sleeping conditions that looked adventurous but not actually horrible. The reality, men sleeping in their own filth, waking up in pain, struggling with chronic illness and exhaustion, would have destroyed the romantic appeal that made pirate stories profitable. The Disney version, beginning with Peter Pan, 1953, and continuing through the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, pushed the sanitization even further. Disney pirates sleep in cozy ship cabins that look like rustic bedrooms, complete with comfortable beds, clean linens, and charming nautical decorations. The sleeping arrangements are so appealing that they've inspired actual bedroom designs for children who want to feel like pirates. This Disneyfication of pirate sleeping has had profound cultural impact. Generations of children have grown up believing that pirate ships were floating playgrounds where the biggest challenge was deciding which comfortable hammock to sleep in. The reality of heat, disease, overcrowding, and chronic pain has been completely erased from popular consciousness. The internet age has made these distortions even worse. Social media is filled with historical facts about pirates that are actually based on movie scenes or completely invented details. Pinterest boards show authentic pirate ship interiors that are actually movie sets or modern recreations designed for comfort rather than historical accuracy. YouTube videos claiming to show real pirate sleeping arrangements typically feature clean, spacious hammocks in well-ventilated areas that bear no resemblance to the cramped, fetid conditions that real pirates endured. These videos get millions of views, spreading misinformation to audiences who believe they're learning actual history. The tourism industry has created its own version of pirate sleeping mythology. Pirate-themed hotels feature authentic ship cabins with comfortable beds, air conditioning, and private bathrooms. Pirate ship tours show visitors crew quarters that are actually modern constructions designed to look rustic but feel comfortable. These tourist attractions have to balance historical interest with customer comfort, so they create sleeping arrangements that suggest the pirate experience without actually reproducing its hardships. Visitors get to feel like they're experiencing pirate life while actually enjoying modern amenities that would have been unimaginable to real pirates. The most persistent modern myth is the idea that pirates had individual hammocks for every crew member. This belief is so widespread that it appears in history textbooks, museum displays, and educational websites. But as we've seen, most pirates never had access to hammocks and spent their entire careers sleeping on hard surfaces in whatever space they could claim. This hammock myth probably originated from confusion between pirate ships and later naval vessels, which did eventually develop standardized hammock systems for their crews. But the myth has become so entrenched that even some historians have accepted it without examining the actual evidence from pirate-era sources. Another persistent distortion is the idea that pirate ships had separate sleeping quarters for different ranks. Movies and books routinely show pirates retiring to their cabins or quarters, suggesting a level of privacy and organization that simply didn't exist on real pirate vessels. This myth makes pirate life seem more civilized and organized than it actually was. The modern obsession with pirate codes and democracy has also distorted our understanding of sleeping arrangements. Popular culture presents pirate ships as floating democracies where everyone had equal rights and fair treatment. While pirate crews did have more democratic elements than legitimate ships, the reality of sleeping arrangements was still harsh, hierarchical, and often unfair. Video games have created their own version of pirate sleeping mythology. Games like Assassin's Creed Black Flag and Sea of Thieves show pirate ships with comfortable sleeping areas, individual beds, and spacious quarters. Players can rest in these virtual pirate beds to restore health or save progress, creating a gaming mechanic that has nothing to do with historical reality. These games reach millions of players, many of whom may never encounter more accurate historical information about pirate life. The gaming version of pirate sleeping, comfortable, restorative, and consequence-free, becomes the reality that shapes how people understand this historical period. The craft and maker movement has embraced pirate sleeping aesthetics without understanding their historical context. DIY websites show how to build pirate ship beds for children, authentic hammock systems for camping, and rustic maritime bedrooms that capture the supposed charm of pirate sleeping arrangements. These modern recreations focus on the visual appeal of pirate sleeping gear, rope hammocks, wooden chests, nautical decorations, while completely ignoring the discomfort, overcrowding, and health hazards that made real pirate sleeping arrangements a form of slow torture. Social media influencers and lifestyle bloggers have created a whole aesthetic around pirate life, featuring carefully staged photos of hammocks on beaches, rustic bedrooms with nautical themes, and authentic pirate experiences that bear no resemblance to historical reality. These images get thousands of likes and shares, spreading romanticized versions of pirate sleeping that erase the suffering and desperation of the real experience. The most troubling aspect of these modern distortions is how they've made it almost impossible to discuss the real history of pirate sleeping arrangements without seeming to destroy people's cherished fantasies. When you tell someone that pirates didn't actually sleep in comfortable hammocks, they often react as if you're trying to ruin their childhood memories or destroy something beautiful and meaningful. This resistance to historical accuracy reveals something important about why these myths persist. People don't want to know about the reality of pirate sleeping because that reality is too harsh, too depressing, too far removed from the adventure and freedom that pirate stories are supposed to represent. But this sanitization does a disservice to the real pirates who endured these conditions. By erasing their suffering, we also erase their resilience, their ingenuity, and their remarkable ability to create community and meaning under impossible circumstances. The real story of how pirates slept is actually more impressive than the fantasy version because it shows what human beings can endure and overcome when they're fighting for their freedom. The modern distortions also prevent us from understanding the true cost of the pirate lifestyle. The romantic versions make piracy seem like a viable alternative to conventional life, when the reality was that most pirates died young, in pain, and far from home. Understanding the brutal reality of pirate sleeping arrangements helps us appreciate why so few people actually chose this life when other options were available. Perhaps most importantly, the sanitized versions of pirate sleeping prevent us from learning the real lessons that this history has to teach. The story of how pirates adapted to impossible sleeping conditions is a story about human resilience, community formation, and survival under extreme stress. These are lessons that might be valuable in our own lives, but we can't learn them if we're only exposed to comfortable fantasies rather than challenging realities. The persistence of these myths shows how powerful storytelling can be in shaping our understanding of history. But it also shows how important it is to seek out primary sources, to question popular assumptions, and to be willing to let go of comfortable lies in favor of more complex and challenging truths. The real story of sleeping on pirate ships may be less comfortable than the Hollywood version, but it's also more human, more inspiring, and ultimately more meaningful than any fantasy we could create. Here's something that might surprise you. The sleeping arrangements we've been exploring didn't disappear when the golden age of piracy ended. They evolved, adapted, and survived in forms that most people never recognize as having pirate origins. The innovations that desperate men developed to survive impossible sleeping conditions on 18th century pirate ships can still be found today in places you'd never expect. The most obvious survival is in naval tradition. Modern military ships still use many of the space-saving, hierarchy-based sleeping arrangements that pirates pioneered. The hot bunking system used on submarines, where crew members share sleeping spaces in rotating shifts, is a direct descendant of the sleep rotation systems that pirates developed when they had more crew members than sleeping spots. Naval architects still design crew quarters using principles that pirates discovered through trial and error. Maximize the number of people who can sleep in minimum space. Create sleeping arrangements that remain functional during rough weather, and establish clear hierarchies that determine who gets the best sleeping positions. But the survival goes much deeper than just military applications. The fundamental principles that governed pirate sleeping arrangements, flexibility, community cooperation, and adaptation to harsh conditions, have reappeared throughout history whenever groups of people have had to survive in extreme circumstances. During the California gold rush of the 1840s and 1850s, miners living in crowded camps developed sleeping arrangements that were remarkably similar to those used on pirate ships. They shared sleeping spaces, rotated access to better accommodations, and created informal hierarchies based on contribution to the community rather than social background. The sleep bucket tradition evolved into the miner's personal kit, a collection of essential items that defined individual identity in an otherwise communal environment. The same patterns emerged during the Great Migrations of the 19th century. Immigrants crossing the Atlantic in steerage class, pioneers traveling west in wagon trains, and workers living in company towns all developed sleeping arrangements that echoed the innovations of pirate crews. They learned to sleep in shifts, to share space efficiently, and to create community bonds through the intimate act of resting together in harsh conditions. The most direct survival of pirate sleeping culture occurred in the merchant marine, where many former pirates found employment after the Golden Age ended. These men brought their hard-won knowledge of shipboard sleeping to legitimate vessels, introducing innovations that improved conditions for ordinary sailors throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Merchant ships began adopting the pirate practice of rotating sleeping privileges based on performance rather than just rank. They developed better ventilation systems for crew quarters, inspired by the pirates' desperate need to create airflow in stifling below-deck spaces. They even adopted modified versions of the sleep bucket system, giving sailors personal storage containers that served many of the same psychological and practical functions. The survival mechanisms that pirates developed for dealing with sleep deprivation and chronic discomfort found new applications in industrial settings. Factory workers during the Industrial Revolution, especially those working night shifts or living in company housing, unconsciously recreated many of the social structures and coping mechanisms that had emerged on pirate ships. The boarding house culture that developed around early factories used rotation systems for beds, shared sleeping spaces, and informal hierarchies that determined access to better accommodations. Workers developed their own versions of sleep rituals and community bonding activities that helped them cope with harsh living conditions and uncertain futures. During both World Wars, military units rediscovered many pirate sleeping innovations out of necessity. Soldiers in trenches, sailors on overcrowded ships, and airmen in temporary bases developed sleeping arrangements that prioritized survival over comfort, community cooperation over individual preference, and flexibility over rigid organization. The buddy system that became standard in military training has its roots in the pirate practice of sleeping partnerships, where crew members would look out for each other's safety and comfort during rest periods. The military tradition of sharing sleeping gear and rotating access to better accommodations directly echoes the resource-sharing systems that pirates developed. Perhaps most surprisingly, many of the psychological coping mechanisms that pirates developed for dealing with harsh sleeping conditions have been rediscovered by modern sleep researchers and incorporated into therapeutic approaches for treating insomnia and sleep disorders. The pirate practice of settling rituals, the elaborate personal routines that helped crew members transition from activity to rest, has been validated by modern sleep science as an effective way to prepare the mind and body for sleep. The pirate understanding that sleep quality depends more on mental preparation than physical comfort has become a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy for sleep disorders. The pirate approach to managing sleep in shifts and fragments has found new relevance in our 24/7 economy. Shift workers, medical professionals, and others who must sleep at irregular hours have rediscovered many of the techniques that pirates used to maintain alertness and health despite disrupted sleep patterns. The survival of pirate sleeping culture is also evident in modern extreme sports and adventure communities. Mountain climbers, long-distance sailors, and polar explorers use sleeping arrangements and coping strategies that would be immediately recognizable to 18th century pirates. They share sleeping spaces, rotate access to better gear, and create strong community bonds through shared hardship. The expedition mentality that governs these modern adventures, the understanding that individual comfort must be subordinated to group survival, that leadership is earned through competence rather than inherited through status, and that everyone must contribute to the collective welfare, is a direct descendant of pirate crew dynamics. Even in civilian contexts, the principles of pirate sleeping arrangements continue to influence how people organize themselves in challenging circumstances. Homeless communities, refugee camps, and disaster relief situations often spontaneously develop sleeping arrangements that echo the innovations of pirate crews. These modern applications demonstrate why pirate sleeping arrangements survived and evolved rather than simply disappearing. They weren't just arbitrary customs or temporary adaptations. They were solutions to fundamental human problems that continue to exist whenever people must live together in harsh conditions with limited resources. The democratic elements of pirate sleeping culture, the idea that everyone deserves rest, that sleeping privileges should be earned rather than inherited, and that the community has a responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members, have influenced broader social movements and political philosophies. The labor movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries adopted many organizational principles that originated in pirate crews, including the idea that workers should have a voice in determining their living and working conditions. The concept of industrial democracy that emerged during this period has clear connections to the democratic traditions that governed pirate sleeping arrangements. Modern concepts of workplace equality, fair housing, and social welfare can trace some of their intellectual roots to the egalitarian principles that pirates developed out of necessity. The idea that basic human needs like sleep and shelter should be distributed fairly, rather than according to social status, was revolutionary in the 18th century, but it has become a cornerstone of modern democratic societies. The survival of pirate sleeping culture also demonstrates the power of practical innovation to outlast the specific circumstances that created it. The techniques that pirates developed for sleeping in impossible conditions were so effective that they continued to be useful long after piracy itself had disappeared. This practical legacy is perhaps more important than the romantic myths that have dominated popular culture. While the fantasy versions of pirate life have entertained generations of readers and moviegoers, the real innovations that pirates developed have continued to help real people solve real problems in challenging circumstances. The persistence of these traditions also reveals something profound about human nature. When people are stripped of conventional social structures and forced to create new ways of living together, they tend to develop remarkably similar solutions. The sleeping arrangements that emerged on pirate ships weren't unique to pirates. They were human responses to universal challenges. This universality helps explain why pirate sleeping culture has been so adaptable and persistent. The fundamental problems that pirates faced, how to rest in uncomfortable conditions, how to share limited resources fairly, how to maintain community bonds under stress, are problems that humans continue to face in various forms. The modern survival of pirate sleeping traditions reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how human beings have solved problems that we still face today. The innovations that desperate men developed on the rolling decks of 18th century pirate ships continue to offer insights and solutions for anyone who must find ways to rest, recover, and maintain hope in challenging circumstances. In recognizing these connections, we begin to understand that the story of sleeping on pirate ships isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a chapter in the ongoing human story of adaptation, survival, and the endless search for ways to make impossible circumstances bearable through community, ingenuity, and mutual care. As we near the end of our journey together tonight, I want you to step back from all the details we've explored, the heat and the smell, the hierarchies and the innovations, the buckets and the hammocks, and the desperate rituals of survival. Step back and ask yourself, what does this story really tell us about what it means to be human? Because that's what we've been exploring all along, isn't it? Not just how pirates slept, but how human beings respond when everything familiar is stripped away, when comfort becomes a luxury, when survival depends on your ability to find rest in circumstances that seem designed to prevent it. The story of sleeping on pirate ships is really the story of human adaptability pushed to its absolute limits. These weren't superhuman people. They were ordinary men, mostly, who had been driven by desperation or circumstance to choose an extraordinary life. And in choosing that life, they discovered something profound about the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to create meaning even in the most meaningless circumstances. Think about what they accomplished. They took the most basic human need, sleep, and found ways to satisfy it under conditions that should have made rest impossible. They were sleeping on hard wooden surfaces in stifling heat, surrounded by disease and filth, under constant threat of violence, with no privacy and no guarantee of safety. And yet they found ways not just to survive, but to create communities, to care for each other, to maintain their humanity. This reveals something fundamental about our species that we often forget in our comfortable modern lives. Human beings are not just remarkably adaptable, we are remarkably creative in our adaptability. We don't just endure harsh conditions, we find ways to transform them, to extract meaning and even beauty from circumstances that seem to offer nothing but suffering. The pirates who developed elaborate rituals around their sleep buckets weren't just organizing their possessions. They were creating sacred space in a world that offered no sanctuary. The crews who shared body heat during cold nights weren't just staying warm, they were affirming their commitment to each other's survival. The men who took turns caring for sick crewmates weren't just being practical, they were maintaining their humanity in circumstances that could easily have reduced them to mere survival machines. But the story also reveals something darker about human nature. The same adaptability that allowed pirates to create community and meaning also allowed them to accept and normalize conditions that were genuinely horrific. They learned to sleep through the smell of human waste, to ignore the suffering of those around them when necessary, to treat violence and death as routine parts of daily life. This dual nature of human adaptability, our ability to find meaning in suffering, but also our ability to become numb to horror, runs through every aspect of the pirate sleeping experience. It's what allowed them to survive, but it's also what made their survival come at such a terrible cost. The democratic elements of pirate sleeping arrangements reveal another fundamental truth about human nature: our deep need for fairness and justice, even in the most lawless circumstances. Pirates who had rejected every other social convention still felt compelled to create systems that distributed sleeping privileges according to some concept of merit or contribution. This wasn't just practical, it was moral. Even men who lived by violence and theft couldn't abandon the human need to believe that their society, however brutal, operated according to some principle of justice. The elaborate rules that governed who slept where weren't just about preventing conflict, they were about maintaining the belief that their community was legitimate, that their choices made sense, that their lives had meaning. But perhaps the most profound truth revealed by pirate sleeping arrangements is about the relationship between freedom and suffering. These men had chosen freedom. Freedom from the rigid social hierarchies of legitimate society. Freedom from the grinding poverty that trapped most people in their birth circumstances. Freedom to determine their own fate through courage and skill, rather than inheritance and social position. But that freedom came at an enormous cost. They paid for it with comfort, with safety, with health, with the possibility of normal human relationships, with any hope of a peaceful old age. Every night that they lay down to sleep on the hard deck of a pirate ship, they were reminded of the price they had paid for their freedom. And yet most of them, given the choice, would have paid that price again. Because what they had gained, the sense of agency over their own lives, the bonds forged through shared danger, the possibility that tomorrow might bring transformation, was worth more to them than comfort or safety or social respectability. This trade-off between freedom and security is one of the fundamental tensions of human existence, and the story of pirate sleeping arrangements illuminates it with unusual clarity. These men had chosen the most extreme version of freedom available to them, and they had discovered both its exhilarating possibilities and its terrible costs. The story also reveals the profound human need for ritual and meaning-making. Even in circumstances that seem to offer no opportunity for spiritual or emotional life, pirates created elaborate systems of meaning around the most basic activities. The way they arranged their possessions, the order in which they settled down to sleep, the care they showed for sick crewmates. These weren't just practical activities, they were rituals that affirmed their humanity and their connection to something larger than mere survival. This need to create meaning from meaninglessness, to find purpose in chaos, to maintain dignity in degrading circumstances, appears to be fundamental to human nature. It's what allowed pirates to endure conditions that would have broken people who couldn't find ways to make those conditions meaningful. But the story also shows us the limits of human adaptability. Many pirates didn't survive, not just physically, but psychologically and spiritually. The harsh conditions, the constant violence, the isolation from normal human society gradually wore away their capacity for normal human emotion and connection. They became, in many ways, less than fully human, reduced to creatures focused entirely on survival and immediate gratification. This degradation wasn't inevitable. Some pirates maintained their humanity throughout their careers, and a few even managed to return to legitimate society. But it was common enough to remind us that human adaptability has its limits, that there are circumstances so harsh that they damage people in ways that can't be repaired. The relationship between individual survival and community welfare that governed pirate sleeping arrangements also reveals something important about human social nature. Pirates discovered that their individual survival depended on the health and cohesion of their community, and they developed sophisticated systems for balancing personal needs with collective welfare. This wasn't altruism, it was enlightened self-interest. But it required a level of social intelligence and emotional maturity that challenges our assumptions about the kind of people who became pirates. These weren't just violent criminals. They were people capable of complex social reasoning and long-term thinking about community welfare. The story of sleeping on pirate ships ultimately reveals that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, both wonderful and terrible, when pushed to their limits. We can create beauty and meaning in the most unlikely circumstances, but we can also become numb to suffering and cruelty. We can develop remarkable systems of cooperation and mutual care, but we can also create hierarchies that perpetuate inequality and injustice. Most importantly, the story reveals that the human spirit is remarkably resilient, but not infinitely so. There are circumstances that will break anyone, conditions that will reduce the most noble person to mere survival instinct. But there are also reserves of strength, creativity, and compassion that emerge only under extreme pressure. Capabilities that we never discover until we're forced to use them. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, in your climate-controlled room, with your clean sheets and your privacy and your safety, remember the men who found ways to sleep on the rolling decks of pirate ships. Remember their ingenuity, their resilience, their capacity to create community and meaning under impossible circumstances. But also remember the cost they paid for their freedom, the ways that their harsh circumstances damaged them, the human potential that was lost to violence and desperation, and the simple, grinding difficulty of trying to rest when rest itself was a form of suffering. Their story is our story, because it's the story of what human beings do when everything familiar is taken away, when survival depends on our ability to adapt, to cooperate, and to find meaning in circumstances that seem to offer none. It's a story about the best and worst of human nature, about the price of freedom and the value of community, about the endless human struggle to remain human when everything around us seems designed to strip away our humanity. And in the end, it's a story about hope. The hope that allowed desperate men to close their eyes each day, believing that tomorrow might be different, that the next horizon might bring the treasure or the adventure or the simple human connection that would make all their suffering worthwhile. The sun is setting now on our journey together, and like those long-ago pirates preparing for their active hours, it's time for us to begin our own transition, not from sleep to wakefulness, but from wakefulness toward the gentle embrace of rest. But before we let go completely, let's take one last look at the ocean as it might have appeared to a pirate settling down for daytime sleep. The Caribbean sun climbing higher, turning the water into a sheet of hammered silver that hurt to look at directly. The ship finding its rhythm for the day, the gentle creaking of timbers that had become as familiar as a heartbeat, the soft splash of waves against the hull that marked the passage of time in a world without clocks. There's something almost meditative about imagining that rhythm, isn't there? The rise and fall of the ship, the constant but gentle motion that rocked those men to sleep despite all the discomfort, all the heat, all the uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring. The ocean itself became their lullaby, the endless song of water and wind and wood that sang them toward whatever dreams were possible in their harsh circumstances. And they did dream, those pirates. In the fragments of testimony that survive, in the scattered accounts of their lives, there are glimpses of the dreams that visited them during their difficult rest. Dreams of home, sometimes, of mothers and wives and children left behind, of familiar landscapes and comfortable beds and the simple pleasure of sleeping between clean sheets. Dreams of treasure, certainly, of the great score that would change everything, that would allow them to retire from their dangerous life and return to the world they had abandoned. But also dreams of simpler things, a full belly, a dry place to sleep, the luxury of privacy, the comfort of safety. Some dreamed of redemption, of finding ways to make amends for the choices they had made, the violence they had committed, the pain they had caused. Others dreamed of revenge against the world that had driven them to piracy, against the systems of inequality and injustice that had made their desperate choice seem like the only option available. But perhaps most often, they dreamed of the sea itself, of endless horizons and favorable winds, of the freedom that came from having no master but the ocean, no law but the unwritten codes they had created for themselves. Even in sleep, even in dreams, the sea called to them, reminding them why they had chosen this life despite all its hardships. The transition from our exploration back to your own rest tonight mirrors, in some small way, the transition that pirates made each day as they moved from the active world of survival and adventure into the vulnerable world of sleep and dreams. Like them, you're moving from a state of alertness and engagement into a state of trust and surrender. But unlike them, you have the luxury of safety, of comfort, of the knowledge that you'll wake up in the same place you fell asleep, surrounded by the same familiar objects, facing the same predictable challenges. You don't have to sleep with one hand on a weapon, don't have to worry about storms or enemies, or the simple possibility that your ship might sink while you rest. This safety that you take for granted was the thing that pirates missed most about their former lives. Not wealth or status or social position, but simply the ability to close their eyes without fear, to surrender completely to sleep without maintaining that constant vigilance that exhausted them even as they rested. As you settle into your own sleeping arrangements tonight, your soft mattress, your clean pillows, your climate-controlled environment, take a moment to appreciate these simple luxuries that represent the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human civilization. Every comfort you enjoy was earned through the struggles of people who came before you, people who slept on hard ground and cold floors and rolling ship decks so that eventually their descendants might know the peace of a safe, comfortable bed. The story of sleeping on pirate ships is part of that larger human story of gradually creating better conditions for rest, for recovery, for the simple human need to lay down our burdens and trust that we'll be safe until morning. It's a story that connects you to every person who has ever struggled to find rest in difficult circumstances, who has ever had to choose between comfort and freedom, who has ever fallen asleep wondering what tomorrow might bring. But it's also a story about the resilience of the human spirit, about our ability to find ways to rest and recover even when everything seems designed to prevent it. Those pirates who learned to sleep on hard decks in stifling heat, who created communities of care and mutual support under impossible circumstances, who maintained their humanity despite living outside the boundaries of civilized society. They proved something important about what we're capable of when we have to be. Their innovations in sleeping arrangements, their rituals of rest and recovery, Their systems for sharing limited resources and caring for the vulnerable. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were expressions of fundamental human values that persist across time and circumstance. The belief that everyone deserves rest, that communities have obligations to their members, that even in the harshest conditions, we can find ways to care for each other. As your own breathing begins to slow and your mind starts to drift towards sleep, you're participating in the same basic human activity that connected those long-ago pirates to every other person who has ever lived. The need for rest, for dreams, for the daily renewal that comes from surrendering consciousness and trusting in tomorrow. This is one of the things that makes us most fundamentally human. The ocean that rocked those pirates to sleep is the same ocean that still covers most of our planet, still singing its ancient song of waves and wind and endless motion. The stars that they navigated by are the same stars that shine down on you tonight, carrying the same light across the same vast distances, marking the passage of time in the same eternal rhythms. In some sense, we're all sailors on the same ocean, all trying to find our way across the vast distances between birth and death, all looking for safe harbors where we can rest and recover before continuing our journey. The pirates who slept on those rolling decks were navigating the same fundamental challenges that you face. How to find meaning in uncertainty, how to create community in isolation, how to maintain hope when the future is unclear. Their story reminds us that human beings have always found ways to adapt, to survive, to create meaning and beauty even in the most unlikely circumstances. It reminds us that the comforts we enjoy today were earned through the struggles of people who came before us, and that we have obligations to use those comforts wisely, to appreciate them fully, and to ensure that future generations have access to even better conditions for rest and recovery. But most of all, their story reminds us that sleep itself is a form of trust. Trust in tomorrow, trust in our communities, trust in the fundamental rhythms of life that carry us from day to night and back to day again. When you close your eyes tonight, you're expressing the same basic faith that those pirates expressed when they lay down on their hard beds. The faith that rest is possible, that recovery is possible, that tomorrow offers new possibilities for adventure, for connection, for the simple pleasure of being alive. The waves that rock them to sleep are still rolling somewhere in the darkness, carrying their own cargo of dreams and hopes and human stories across the endless ocean of time. And you, settling into your own rest tonight, are part of that same eternal story, connected across the centuries to everyone who has ever sought the peace and renewal that comes from surrendering to sleep. And so we return, as all stories must, to where we began, with that image of pirates sleeping peacefully in their hammocks, gently rocking with the ocean's rhythm under a canopy of stars. But now you know the truth behind that image, don't you? You know about the heat and the smell, the hierarchies and the innovations, the desperate rituals and the remarkable resilience that made sleep possible under impossible circumstances. The hammock is still there in your mind, but it's no longer the comfortable fantasy of adventure stories. It's become something more complex, more human, a symbol of adaptation and survival, of the endless human struggle to find rest and meaning in a world that often seems designed to prevent both. Tonight, as you drift toward your own sleep, you carry with you the stories of men who found ways to rest on the rolling decks of pirate ships, who created communities of care and mutual support under conditions that would challenge anyone's humanity. Their struggles have become part of your understanding, their innovations part of your appreciation for the simple luxury of a safe, comfortable bed. But their story doesn't end with their sleep, just as your story doesn't end with yours. Sleep is not an ending, it's a pause, a renewal, a preparation for whatever tomorrow might bring. Those pirates who closed their eyes on the hard decks of their ships were not surrendering to their circumstances. They were gathering strength for another day of survival, another day of freedom, another day of the endless human adventure of trying to create meaning from chaos. The ocean that carried them through their dreams is still out there, still singing its ancient song of possibility and danger, of freedom and cost, of the endless horizons that call to the human spirit. And somewhere in that song, in the rhythm of waves against distant shores, the echo of their story continues, a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they must be, that we can find ways to rest and recover even when everything seems designed to prevent it. As your own breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, remember that you are part of that same story, connected across time to everyone who has ever struggled to find peace in difficult circumstances, who has ever had to choose between comfort and freedom, who has ever fallen asleep wondering what dreams might come. The stars that guided those long-ago navigators are the same stars that shine down on you tonight, carrying the same ancient light across the same vast distances, marking the passage of time in rhythms that connect all human experience. In their light, the boundaries between past and present begin to blur, and you become part of the eternal human story of seeking rest, finding meaning, and maintaining hope in the face of uncertainty. The sleep bucket sits empty now, its owner long since returned to the sea that claimed so many of his kind. But the human need it represented, the need for a small space that belongs to us alone, for possessions that define our identity, for dignity in the face of degradation. That need continues in every person who has ever tried to create a home in hostile circumstances. The rituals of settling, of remembering, of caring for others, these too continue, transformed but recognizable, in every community that faces hardship together. The tea shared before sleep becomes the bedtime story read to a child. The checking on sick crewmates becomes the phone call to an elderly parent. The careful arrangement of possessions becomes the nightly routine that helps us transition from the chaos of day to the peace of night. And the fundamental truth that those pirates discovered, that human beings can endure almost anything if they have community, purpose, and hope, that truth echoes through every generation, every struggle, every person who has ever had to find strength they didn't know they possessed. The ship itself has long since rotted away, its timbers returned to the ocean that shaped them. But the lessons learned on its rolling deck persist, that adaptation is possible, that community can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that the human spirit is remarkably resilient, but also remarkably fragile, requiring care and tending like a flame that must be protected from the wind. As you settle deeper into your own rest, let the gentle motion of your breathing become the rhythm of waves against a hull. Let the softness of your pillow become the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human innovation in the pursuit of comfort and safety. You are the inheritor of all those struggles, all those adaptations, all those small victories against circumstances that seemed insurmountable. The pirates who learned to sleep on hard decks gave you something precious, proof that human beings can find ways to rest and recover even when everything seems designed to prevent it. Their story becomes your story, their resilience becomes your inheritance, their hard-won wisdom about survival and community becomes part of your understanding of what it means to be human. And in the morning, when you wake refreshed and safe in your comfortable bed, you'll carry forward something of their spirit, their refusal to surrender to circumstances, their commitment to caring for others even when resources were scarce, their faith that tomorrow might bring new possibilities for adventure, for connection, for the simple pleasure of being alive. The ocean continues its eternal song, waves rolling toward shores that those long-ago pirates will never see, carrying stories and dreams and the endless human hope for something better just beyond the horizon. And you, settling into sleep in your safe harbor, become part of that song, part of that story, part of the endless human journey toward rest, toward peace, toward the dreams that sustain us through whatever storms may come. Sleep well, knowing that you are connected across time to everyone who has ever sought rest in difficult circumstances, everyone who has ever found ways to care for others when caring seemed impossible, everyone who has ever closed their eyes in trust that morning would come, bringing with it new possibilities for the ancient human adventure of survival, community, and hope. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, The ocean sings its timeless lullaby, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, the story continues. Your story, their story, the endless human story of finding ways to rest and dream and hope, no matter how harsh the circumstances, no matter how uncertain the future, no matter how far we are from the safe harbors we call home. Rest now and dream of gentle seas.